Hey, good morning. This is Mike Capps. Going to do the lesson this morning. Today I'm going to talk to a couple of Jesus's parables. I'm not going to delve into what they mean, but in how they carry their meaning and why that's important. In other words, how does the Bible work? And when it works as literature, which it does as a parable, how does it do that work? So, you can think of it also, why was it a good idea that Jesus taught in parables and stories, and even with the story of his own life? I'm a bit of a repertory teacher at Wilshire. I've taught on this subject a few times, but I've added things to it. So hopefully this is a good introduction for the way I teach for some of you that haven't been in my classes, and a refresher for some of you guys that have. So let me start, I think, with a quick thought experiment. If we start with the question, who is my neighbor? What comes to mind? And for most of us, it's Jesus' parable on the Good Samaritan. And your recollection probably came as a rush of memory, a familiar story, a human story, and it has a lot of complex emotional dramas, and a little bit of truth, mysterious truth that kind of eludes us at sometimes, much like any film or novel or short story you may have read. So I'm going to start off today by just reading one of these. I'm going to read Luke 10 on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this translation, by the way, is the new translation by David Bentley Hart. Interesting read. And look, a certain lawyer stood up to test him, saying, "Teacher, by what deeds may I inherit life in the age?" And he said to them, "What has been written in the law? How do you read it?" And in reply he said, "You shall love the Lord your God out of the whole of your heart, and in the whole of your soul, and in the whole of your strength, and in the whole of your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You answered correctly. Do this, and you shall live." But he, wishing to vindicate himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Taking this up, Jesus said, "A certain man was going down from Jerusalem, and he fell among bandits, who stripped him and rained blows upon him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And by a coincidence, a certain priest was going down by that road, and, seeing him, passed on the opposite side. And a Levite also, coming upon the place, and seeing him, passed by on the opposite side. But a certain Samaritan on a journey came to him, and was inwardly moved with compassion, and approaching, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and setting him upon his own mount, he brought him to a lodge and cared for him. And taking out 2 denarii, on the following day he gave them to the keeper of the lodge and said, "Take care of him, and whatever you spend beyond this, I shall repay you upon my return." Who of these 3, does it seem to you, became a neighbor to the man falling among the bandits? And he said, "The one treating him with mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So a great parable story, a short story, the shortest of short stories. And again, we've talked a lot about over the years what that story means, particularly a lot of late. But this is, in this case, the word of the Lord literally. This is Jesus, the author, writing a story for us to receive. So let's talk about a little bit how that works. So I've heard, like you, a lot of analogies for the Bible over the years. The one that I used to hear a lot was the Bible is God's owner's manual, as if it were a fact sheet or a training guide something that presented us with the doctrines, instructions, and how to live, along the lines of, how to change a tire or check the oil. And I have found that one to be very unhelpful, actually, over the years. I've never read an owner's manual that read like one of Jesus's parables, although that would be interesting, but that would be a digression. So the Bible, as we would assert, I think is useful for your theological inquiry, for formation of doctrine, but it's not just that. It also works as a historical document. It's a story of Israel, the life and works of Jesus, and the stories and letters of the early church. But it's not just a historical document. It also is a work of literature. It works in the same way that art works, and that is important. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. So we have Scripture as something of a three-legged stool. It's a triangle that forms a whole. It gets wobbly if we only use one or two of the legs, but none of them should eclipse the other or be longer than the other. They work in that trio. So how does it work with literature? We started with the question. The question asked to Jesus is, who is my neighbor? And Jesus responded with a story. And it works in reverse. If I were to name a parable, let's say the prodigal son, then questions come to mind to you. What is mercy? What emotions do radical mercy unleash in the various characters? We see a whole idea freighted in a story which is kind of mysteriously incarnate and whole, and lodged in us once we hear it. And it's a familiar story. It's got all the complex emotional dramas that you would expect from a story, and it bears a profound truth that's somewhat mysterious. We can never get to the bottom of exactly what it means, but we know that there's something in there that we can plunge into again and again. And I think we recognize it as true. It's true to life. It's not just an analogy or an answer to a loaded question that helps the answerer get out safely. It actually is a little short story, a mini experience. I would say we also know that it's important that the story, we understand that the story might not be literally true. But we know that it's true in a larger sense, and that we recognize the truth that is inhabited in that parable. And we almost feel like it could have happened to us. And as such, it has the ability to make us feel, even to the point of giving us, that experience of an encounter. And you can't have an experience, you can't unhave it, pardon me. You've heard it, you can't unhear it or easily forget it. So we recognize in that encounter the truth, that it's artfully realized, it's relatable to us, and you might even say that it's incarnate in the story. So that pardon me, in that regard, has a lot of similarities with art and literature. So why is it important that Scripture has this literary aspect to it? It was observed even very early. Augustine, for example, talked about the beauty and the literary quality of the Bible being one of its glories. And from a practical standpoint, these qualities, literary qualities, help us resist the temptation or the need to receive the truth and the content of Scripture in some kind of atomistic analysis that's kind of can be reduced to a theological outline or proof texts of ideas that we're looking for. And one of my concerns that we have, particularly in the church these days, is the relatively low view of art and literature and the theological implications of what Scripture loses when we don't see it with those qualities. In a lot of cases, there's distrust for art in general because it can't be controlled. It's not safe. We can't distill it into a single idea. or a series of ideas, and then safely explain it and control it and defang it. It's kind of wild. It can't be caged, like the way the priests and the Pharisees in Jesus' day couldn't control Jesus. So art in this sense is wild. It's uncontrollable in the same way that God is wild and uncontrollable by us. So scripture, when it takes a form of the work of art, also carries, and offers us a little bit of this wild mystery. And at times it rightfully eludes our attempts to reduce it and control it, mirroring the mystery of God. So I'll bet a lot of you have had the experience in an art museum or reading a poem or something and thinking, what does this mean? I just don't get it. And even if we learn over time to understand the painting more or the poem better, and we familiarize ourselves with the form or the poet or the painter, the best works never actually give us everything that they have. They keep driving us deeper into that mystery. It's a mystery that can both bring us comfort and it can also make us uncomfortable. And a lot of times we revisit the same works of art over and over again, or the same stories in the Bible, the same parables, the same scriptures over and over again, because they're never quite done. They have an unfathomable kind of dimension to them that we can never get everything out of it. You might be surprised to know, I think, that most writers, artists, composers, poets, they don't even fully understand everything that is freighted in the works that they've made with their own hands. I think the Bible writers were self-conscious that they were actually using literary devices. We have a statement in Ecclesiastes, for example, 12:9-10, that says, not only was the teacher wise, but he imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. Then 10, the teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. So we have a moment there where the teacher was talking about the craft of putting together the scriptures that they had, and that the beauty and expression, picking just the right words, were important. So I know what a lot of you guys are probably thinking. The Bible isn't merely literature. I had a conversation a number of years ago with Leland Ryken, an English professor at Wheaton, who wrote a book on the Bible's literature, and he was describing how much hate mail that he received. Most of the ilk was the Bible is scripture, it is not literature. Kind of missing the point of Ryken's book, that it functions in many places like literature. So the fact that we associate fiction with literature is part of the problem, I think, but that's not the only way to appreciate literature, and we risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So by this logic, we can study the Bible with the techniques of literature to get at what they're trying to say. So let's then return to how art works and see if we recognize a few things here. So generally, a work of art helps us recognize or re-recognize what we already know as being true, or to rethink, to recognize what we understand as true. A couple lines from Denise Levertov in a poem that she has. It says, "Wisdom is a stone that dwells in forgotten pockets, lost, then revealed again in the palm of the mind's hand." So she's saying the art works a little bit like you put your hand in your pocket and you find some money or a stone or something you'd forgotten about, and it reminds you again of that. And that's in some sense how scripture, various scriptures, parables, and these stories work. And it also does it in a sneaky way. Emily Dickinson famously proclaimed that poetry should tell all the truth, but to tell it slant. And she doesn't say that to assert that poets or other artists have some kind of special claim to know what is true. Her point is when a work of art does its work well, whatever truth it bears should be marshaled by the poet. in this case, Jesus answering teachings in the parables, to move around our defenses or our indifference to take root in our imagination. And there it can work in ways that we're not habitually prepared to ignore or resist it. And then once the truth gets in, as in Jesus's parable, we begin to bend toward it. We become to recognize it. Dickinson goes on to say that truth has a dangerous power as well. And she says, it must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And this is essential because art helps the truth get in past our defenses, our desires, our biases, our expectations, our indifference. And it's generally going to cause some trouble. Unpopular truths are frequently scoffed at or even violently resisted before they're accepted as being obvious. And I had a Sunday school teacher once that said that Jesus taught in parables as a clever way to avoid getting in trouble with the religious leaders when they asked him these trick questions. I think he taught in parables because he knew us as humans, how we work, how we operate, and that we are capable of rejecting or reshaping straightforward answers if we receive them that way. So when he responds with a parable, Jesus is treating us as he knows us to be as human beings who need to understand a little bit more than the straight answer for it to work with us. So in this story, in this example, someone asked Jesus who he thought their neighbors might be. And more to the real point, just exactly what kind of people might be considered the wrong kind of people, which is kind of what the question was really about. And Jesus knew that these questions betrayed the brokenness of the people that asked them, and that they're not likely to apprehend an answer, that they're seeking. And if Jesus just said, everybody is your neighbor, we would immediately start crafting the various exceptions, the additions, the subtractions to that answer, and just get back to our habit of drawing lines and trying to name who's in and who's out. So Jesus told it slant, as Dickinson said, and responded with a parable, a poetic analogy. And they're not, I think, meant to just deliver a safe or clever response to a loaded question. I think that undervalues them by a mile. They're really astonishing and artful stories, and they sneak in the side door. And there, when they lodge in our brain, they begin to woo our imagination and our heart and start to bend us towards the truth. Because he responds in a poetic form, it's also freighted, the truth is freighted in a way that it can't be forgotten. We've heard the story and we can't unhear it. You can't unring the bell, as the saying goes. And it's as if we had the experience ourselves, and inhabits us like, our own memories. And so it becomes incarnate in us in a way that we may not fully understand everything that's there in the story, but it's inside nonetheless, bending us and wooing us, more than just giving us direct information or answers to a question. And by that way, I think that method, they're more powerful. And it's, the truth is freighted in a way that we can't abduct it. We can't run off with it and make it mean what we want it to mean. It becomes resilient. It resists our efforts to warp it towards our own agenda. And because it's freighted in a story, it's hard to us to vandalize it, to plunder it, or reduce it to an extractable idea, as we were talking about earlier. So these words are kind of still alive in that sense. They were 2,000 years ago that they were said, but we still hear them fresh. They're still alive in us. So I've skipped a bit because we had some technical difficulties. But I appreciate your time. Thank you for your patience if you've been hanging on. And I hope to get to see all of you again soon when all this is over. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.